Karen Etingin is the owner of L'Affichiste, a poster shop in Montreal. She's been collecting posters for more than 30 years. She buys posters from collectors at auctions and from other dealers. She travels the world looking for the best pieces to sell in her gallery. L'Affichiste also sells posters on consignment. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now I'm broadening the scope of the program to include print culture. So that's why you're here, broadening it from books. So I was in Montreal a couple of years ago at this excellent Polish restaurant. And walking to the hotel nearby, I happened upon your store and I looked in the window and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that there was a store like this in Montreal. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about what was in there.
Well, I mean, we're the only vintage poster gallery in Canada, and in the world, there are probably less than 50 actual vintage poster dealers. There are many people who say that they sell vintage posters, but they're not all actually vintage. And what you probably saw in the window when you passed by was a collection of posters like the ones behind me, which are Polish zoo posters, or you saw posters from France from the turn of the last century, or small
Right.
frame pieces. We also have some contemporary pieces by contemporary Quebec poster designers, which is one of the ways that we try and work towards continuing the tradition of poster art, because it kind of got lost for a little while, but I presume that that's what you saw when you looked in the window. That's what I enjoy collecting. So we have about 10,000 posters from every country, every period. Printed poster art probably started in one form or another in the late 1700s. So we have
Mhm.
posters from that period up until
Is that
now.
Seidenfeld or?
Probably, it depends where you are. And, the Germans think that they started the print process. The French believe that they did. So you can find examples in both countries. I would say Europe to be sure. The French really like to say that they are the home of the original modern poster, but I think that the Germans or the Austrians would have a fair claim to that as well.
Okay. So you started off as a collector?
I did. I started off when I was living in New York. I would pass by a gallery that probably looked like mine and was run by a lady in her late middle age. She
What
was
was her
very
name?
Laura Gold. She was one of the few people, and certainly one of the only women, who brought modern poster art collecting to New York in the 70s and 80s. And she was very patient, and she taught me a lot. And whenever I would make a little money, I would go buy another poster. That's how I started collecting. And I think that my gallery now is probably pretty much like her gallery was at the time. She was in Carnegie Hall. She had a small shop on the street level and then a larger space upstairs, and where she would show posters, and she would say things like, well, I can let you have it for $2,500. Like she was doing me a favor. I don't use that terminology, but she was very patient and kind, and she knew a lot about posters. So I think she was really very significant in my poster collecting journey.
Okay, so what'd you go after specifically to start with?
Oh, things I liked. So at the time I was living in New York, and I wasn't making a whole lot of money, and my rent was very expensive. So I was buying smaller prints, and there was a collection of printed pieces that were part of a series that came out in the late 1890s called the Maître de l'Affiche. And they were small posters. And if you were a subscriber, you got four small posters, like 12 by 18, 12 by 17 inches every month. And so that's what I started collecting, because that's what I could afford. And then when I got a raise, I would go in and get a bigger poster sometimes. And the Maître de l'Affiche is a wonderful way for people to start collecting, because it's still a very affordable collection, most of it. And most actual vintage poster dealers have pieces from that collection. In fact, if you look on my site, you'll see any vintage poster dealer should have some pieces from that grouping on their site.
Okay, so what exactly is that? What is it?
It's a group of I don't have the book here, but probably 200 or 300 smaller posters that were reproductions made in the 1890s of the original posters as they were presented at the time. So it's a group that represents posters from around the world. Each actual print was printed by the same print house in Paris called Chaix, Chaix. So each of the maîtres de l'affiche have the embossed logo of Chaix, and they're numbered, and they're a beautiful way to start collecting if you like classic vintage posters. I'll send you the link so you can put it on your website or wherever you wish.
Okay, yeah. And what was it about though? It was affordability and just you like the aesthetics? What?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a house where my mom and my grandmother were both artists, so there was a lot of art around the house, and I am not myself a capable artist, so I can appreciate art, but I can't produce it. So these seem like a lovely thing to have, and I think many people are collectors, and so I didn't realize that my tiny little poster collection would turn into something that I ended up spending decades pursuing, but it's something I enjoy. I have some of my grandmother's sculptures and some of my mother's paintings and posters everywhere. I'm a very visual person, so they keep me both busy and calm at the same time. I mean, I can look at the posters that I love for a long time and just find something very familiar and calming about them. So it's probably the way you are with the book.
It's hard to define, isn't it? It's just yeah, kind of calm, but also a feeling of excitement as well at the same time. It's a bit strange.
Yeah, well, it's funny because this often, because there's so few poster dealers around, I often get called when people want to sell posters or give them up on consignment or know what they're worth, evaluate them. So this morning I went to see a French Canadian fellow who lives not far from here, and he said, I have this great collection of posters. And I'm always highly skeptical, and they weren't amazing. They were okay. And they were all, they had been his posters, so they all had pinholes in the corners, and they looked like they had lived a lovely life, which is great, but takes down their value. But my point is, I could tell by just lifting the corner of each poster which poster it was, because they're posters I know. It's like you looking at the spine of a book and recognizing the cover art and knowing which book it is without reading the title, because it's familiar. So for me, there is a comfort and an excitement and a familiarity with posters. I'm always happy to see artists or discover artists. I think when you were in the gallery last week, I showed you a collection of posters by a Czech artist that I have never heard of before. I was lucky enough to buy a grouping of, I don't know, 30 posters, oversized, excellent condition, very graphic. They will be affordable in the gallery, and they were affordable to me. So I'm always open to finding new things, but there is a sense of comfort in the familiarity of certain images or certain artists. I know who they are, I know what they are, and they make me happy.
Mhm. I mean, that's a good definition of what a collector should do. Get that kind of feeling and then go after what gives them that feeling.
And what they can afford. I think sometimes collectors or younger people who are starting a collection think, oh, I should buy the most important piece. But it's really, if you're buying it as something you're going to look at, I'm looking at posters in front of me, there are posters behind me as well, but it should be something you like. It shouldn't necessarily only be by a gold standard artist, because you're going to live with it. It's not like real estate where you're going to flip it. You can, with some classic posters, do that, but these are generally things you're going to hold on to and pass on to your children or somebody else. And the spec market in posters is not huge. There are certain posters that a Toulouse-Lautrec or other posters that are like the Holy Grail that are $50,000 or $100,000, but the large majority of posters are still affordable. to people of means, and it's really people of means who have extra money who collect anything. What I like to do now is have posters that are affordable to almost anyone. If you're going to go
Yeah.
to IKEA and spend $100 on a piece of framed art that literally millions of people have, you could also come into the gallery and buy an original silkscreen poster by a local artist for $100 and have something that very few people have. I think it's always more challenging to find the people who want to stand out from the herd rather than, go into the herd. But I'm not looking for thousands of people to buy the same poster. I love it, but I love my posters. I'm happy when they're placed in happy homes. People like you or other people come to the gallery every time they're in Montreal and they say, oh, we remember our trips because we know we've been to Montreal 4 times because we have 4 posters from you. Oh, that's nice. It makes me feel as if I'm doing something and giving other people an appreciation of an art form that I have myself. So it's nice.
Well, speaking of my visit, when we went in there, one of your colleagues, Leah, gave us it was like a tour of the history of posters. We were in there, and I mean, yeah, she's got really well developed forearms because she does this all the time. But it was wonderful looking through
Well,
all
I'm
this.
glad you enjoyed it, but that's the way poster dealers, generally speaking. I mean, there are some who only sell online, but poster dealers who work with the public have a long table, and the posters are usually only handled by gallery staff and move from one side of the table to the other so that you can display them properly. And oftentimes in a gallery like ours, there'll be a place where you can display them on the wall, because when you're looking down on a poster on a table, the perspective is different than when you're looking at it head on or face on. But I'm very lucky to work with young women, and it's generally women, I don't know why, but who are passionate, who become passionate about the gallery, the posters, the education that's kind of required to teach people about what they're looking at. And I enjoy the team, the camaraderie that we have. We're fond of each other.
You all sleep together on the same couch, right?
Well, not exactly. You're going to give people the wrong idea. What you're talking about is I finally got a couch for the basement so that when I get snoozy after a dumpling lunch, I can take a 10-minute snooze and go back to work. We take shifts in the snooze department, but the girls are, I'm fond of, I mean, I'm old enough to be their mother, their grandmother, but we have a very intimate relationship, and we share stories. And we used to joke that we have group therapy every Saturday morning before we start work. And it's nice to be in that kind of an environment because I love what I do, and to have other people be as passionate about what I'm doing as I am, it's a great gift. I recognize it's my business, it's not their business, but they like what they do and they're responsible. And when Leah was showing you the posters, it was something that, you could feel it, I think, because she knows the stories of the posters. She's able to repeat them to you and explain them in a way that draws you in, because the posters themselves draw you in, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, really, that's what they're designed to do in the first place.
Exactly.
And in fact, here's a little list of things that the Poster House Gallery Museum in New York suggests that posters issues that they bring up: mass communication and persuasion, salesmanship, the intersection of art and commerce, the control of the public domain, and the fact that they're symbols of technological advancement and aesthetic evolution. They do a
Yeah,
lot of different things, don't they?
they do. Well, Angelina Lippert, who wrote that, and I are very connected because we're both poster people. I mean, there are not that many poster nerds in the world. So, but there are lots of things that have been written historically about posters. And what I would add to what you've just said is that they are symbols of social, political, and technological history,
Yeah.
because they're documents that you can look at and really, whether it's the printing itself, the message, the manner, Some posters in the 1890s were issued twice because if the censors thought they were too risque, they'd cover up the boobs or the groin of a man because, the public shouldn't see that. But there's a very old article that you can find online written by Susan Sontag about the political posters of the 1960s. And she discusses that posters in the public sphere and the public square are documents that have no equal, because the reaction that she was specifically writing about political posters and Cuba, but I think any propaganda poster that you would look at, let's say now about the war in the Middle East, any poster would get a visceral reaction. Maybe not the same. If you had 5 people passing by, you might have 6 different reactions. So, or 10. And I think that that's what posters are good at. They draw you in, they give you a message in an instant, the flick of an eyelid. So they have to be powerful and they have to be clear, whether it's a product or a protest or anything. The artists that were used by the French during World War I were called France's secret weapon, one of France's secret weapons, because they were so good at political persuasion, getting the public to be interested. And that's a great skill. I couldn't do that. I'm passionate about posters. You probably hear it, but I'm describing something that when you look at it, it in and of itself is a message that you can't ignore.
Well, this is interesting because I mentioned his name, Lucien Bernhardt, right or just before the First World War. His posters just covered Berlin. One of his real innovations was to boil the image down to something that stood on its own and showed you the product in a really dramatic, clean way. But the reason he did that partly is because people went by on trams, and as you say, they only had a few seconds, and so he had to imprint on their brain one image that was memorable.
Yeah, the German style has a particular name. It's called Plakatstil, and it's really very distilled, as you say. Very different than the French style, which was more romantic and more, even the war posters are evocative. The German war posters, first and second, are not, there's nothing subtle about them. And Bernhard and others of his generation in Germany and Austria were masters of distillation, also using negative space, very more than refined. I think distilled would be a good word. That brought it down really to the bare, the basics.
So the modern poster really sort of took off in the mid 1800s. And that was largely because of the development of lithography.
So in France, there's somebody that they call the father of the modern poster, and his name is Jules Charest. He was very active I think probably starting in the 1870s, 1880s. He was one of the people who taught Toulouse-Lautrec about lithography, and I'm going to say mostly lithography because I think Toulouse-Lautrec had his own style. Anyway, so I don't know very much about chromolithography, but I can tell you about lithography, which is what Charest used at the height and at the onset of his career. And you can see the development of Charest, how he progressed with the development of lithography. A printing press had a limited size. It could not be bigger than 42 or 43 inches by 62 or 64 inches. But if you want a poster that's bigger than that, then you need what's called a 2-sheet poster or a 3-sheet poster. So it's 2 posters that are attached together, but when you're printing one at a time. So both the artist and the lithographer have to imagine what the completed project will look like. So it's a different form of art. You're visualizing something you're creating something that hadn't existed before in a technological printing sense. So as printing evolved, Charest was able to evolve with it. I don't know if I answered your question, but like when Charest wanted to create the idea of sparkles or glitter, he would take sand, cover it in ink, and put it on the printing press so that when the press went, it would give the idea of spark. I mean, that's kind of genius.
Well, I read that somehow he developed a technique of adding a lot more color to his posters and used innovative typography and was credited with introducing, I question this, but sexuality. These charrettes, they were called.
Correct. Well, sure. Sexuality in the sense of the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. I mean, he was selling products. So if he was selling the idea of an electrified lamp, which was modern, he would show it by showing the glow on a woman's face. Sexuality depends on the period. So the glow of a woman's face was or maybe décolleté was considered.
The word provocative was used.
No, I would disagree with that. If you would look at a charrette, she looks like the most demure. She's not a sex symbol. She's a feminine woman in a pinched waist, fully covered dress. She's not. No, I would disagree with that. Sorry.
Okay. No worries. I'm not sure where I got it from, but I would say that you are the expert because you've probably looked at a ton of them.
I know expert is a big term. I know a lot about posters. I'm definitely a poster nerd.
Okay.
And Tourette's or something I know. So
Okay. You go after posters. What do you look for when you pull the trigger?
I look for things that are unusual. So if there are 40 or 50 poster dealers in the world, each of our collections reflect our personalities. I like to have things that other dealers might not have. I have, like, I'm looking, you can't see because they're in front of me, but I have a deep collection of Danish and Swedish posters from the early 1900s until the mid, like 70s or 80s, just because I have access to them, because I've developed, sometimes somebody contacts you and it opens a window. So what do I look for? Things that I think are pretty. I don't have a whole lot of military posters. I don't like them. After the first decade or so, I realized I couldn't keep all the posters I was buying. So I also try and find things that are sellable.
And what's sellable?
Well, posters that are in good condition, posters that have a pedigree, posters that, you can put up in your living room or dining room without being embarrassed. Provocative Polish posters, for instance, are a hard sell. There are a lot of them that are dark. There's some that are really over the top, they're not seductive. They're just naked. It's not because I'm a prude. It's just like they're posters you look at and you're like, this guy was really disturbed. It was a very disturbed time. But
Right.
I have a lot of them because one of the collectors for whom I sell had about 500 Polish posters, which are now on my website. Some of them I love. They kind of range from circus posters of happy clowns to really depraved, sad posters.
Is it optimism that sells?
Yeah, I think that would be a nice way to put it. Yeah. You went through the pile with Leah, so I think the only thing that unites those posters is, first of all, they cover the spectrum of the period within which posters were produced. They're from all over the globe. I love design posters from Italy. Swedish design posters are very clean and elegant and can go into almost any setting. I like travel posters. Swiss Air did a beautiful series in the 70s that we love. I just got a very rare set of posters from the National Institute of Science and something or other from the US in the 1960s. Super expensive, super rare, excellent condition. Lucian Bernhardt, who you were talking about before, those posters are very beautiful, but they're becoming increasingly hard to find, and they're very specific. That's a specific kind of collector who can appreciate them, display them, afford them. I try and have a few of those pieces, but more pieces that are acceptable and accessible to people who are looking to start a collection. They have a new condo, they have a new house. I used to get very offended when people would come in and say, I'm looking for something for the basement, because it would imply to me that they're looking for something less expensive, less important.
For the bathroom.
I can't get offended by people like that anymore, but I would know that I had succeeded when they left the gallery with two pieces, to frame the fireplace. So we've moved from the basement to the fireplace. So that's good. So I like to have pieces that you can put in your basement, but also pieces that can frame the fireplace.
Hmm. Okay. I mean, collecting posters, I mean, you supposed to frame them all or or you just sort of lie them down and look at them every now and again? I mean, what's the story there?
Again, it depends on what your means are. I sell to the National Archives of Quebec, and they have of course, a beautiful archive, and everything is flat and tissue paper and white gloves. That's rare. Often people have like an architect's drawer set of drawers where
Mm.
you can put things flat. That would be ideal in the dark, no dust. If you frame them, they should be framed by a proper framer. When you buy a poster from the gallery, we'll give you framing guidelines to give to your framer. I've spoken to framers who know how to frame and framers who don't know how to frame. It's always better if you go to a professional when doing anything, and framing a vintage poster is definitely one of those times when you want to be with someone who knows what they're doing.
What's an example of a badly framed poster then? Like what does that look like?
Oh, they use glue, they don't use archival backing, they cut the poster, they stretch the poster. I mean, there are lots of bad framers.
Okay. And do you put all your posters on linen? Is that it?
No, I used to put a lot of posters on linen, but that's an expensive process. It doesn't necessarily add value to the poster. It just makes it more, tangibly strong. But if I'm looking again at two posters in front of me that have not been linen back, then oftentimes I'll say that a poster of a certain age looks like a woman of a certain age. We have wrinkles, we have chin hairs, we're not perfect, but there's a charm in older women, of course, and older posters,
Of course.
because you can see that they've lived a life. Some of them have tax stamps, some of them have. My favorite is when you can see in the charade period a fingerprint of the printer because it accidentally got in the ink while it was running through it's just a very human thing. And I think posters are really human. They show the best of humanity. They show the worst also, but they're inspiring. They're colorful. They're great. I mean, I really love posters. I am completely not objective, I have to say.
Yeah, I did notice that. Yeah,
Well, it's a good obsession to have. It's
it
healthy.
totally is. Yeah, yeah. Let's have a look here then at what did you do when you actually started up, when you converted from a collector to a seller? Like what'd you do?
Well, I'm not entirely sure what you mean because I've always done a bunch of things. So when I was collecting, it was while I was working in New York, and I think when I opened the gallery, I had created a business plan that was completely unrealistic. I thought that I could sell one big poster a year and pay my rent. And I knew how to do business plans. I mean, I was a business person. That was completely stupid because the kind of people who walk in are not going to buy big posters right away. And B, that's just stupid. So it took me, my first gallery was on the second floor of a very old bank building in Montreal. And I used to have great naps because nobody knew I was there. And, I'd sleep all afternoon. And then somebody would ring the bell on occasion and come in. So now I can't nap anymore because the gallery is busier. But
But
it,
wouldn't you think that would be an automatic that you would put it on the main floor where like
well, there
or
was a
not?
gallery downstairs, so I thought that
Okay.
I could kind of cannibalize from their traffic, but I didn't know that they didn't have any traffic either. And it was at a really important intersection. Anyway, I was there for a while. I was learning about the business. This is a particular business, it's not selling widgets. It's not, I
No.
had worked before selling for, high-end fragrance and fashion, and then I sold flight simulator. I mean, like a very different kind of milieu, and this is specific. I love it, but it's very different. It's much slower paced, it's much more academic, it's much more refined in certain ways. And it took a very long time to grow a business that has its own steam. Poster nerds are, we're few and far between. Angelina, who we mentioned before, worked for a very fine auction house in New York, and then she was tapped to be I don't know what her title is, but I'm going to go with head curator at Poster House, which is a great job because it's you get to put on exhibitions, deal with posters, travel around and highlight an art form that more people need to know about. I think Poster House is really doing a great job in publicizing posters to a generation that hasn't seen them before. People don't really
Mhm.
pay attention to street art, or they haven't been. Now maybe they will.
Where do you find them? eBay?
No, definitely not eBay. I like to see posters. Posters, if you were looking, for instance, on eBay at an actual vintage poster and a copy of a vintage poster, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But you have to kind of feel it, see it, look how it's printed. I always look for mistakes because a poster printed in the 1880s or the 1920s isn't going to be perfect. So where do I find them? People bring them to me. I've been collecting for a million years, so I have places I like to go and people I know, and I have
Like
people.
where?
Well, there's a guy in Milan who I know. There's a little French guy who I've actually never met who contacted me online, and I presume he's an older man because he yells at me in capital letters, and he has a collection of old lottery posters that I love, and it's just, or people walk in with, I had a couple that walked in that at one point, I guess they had had a villa in, I don't know, the south of France, and times changed and they no longer had or could afford the villa and the posters that graced it. And so I'm selling their posters for them. I, I had a couple that used to be married that individually came in. She came in and he came in with the posters that they got in the divorce. So I
Put
didn't.
them on consignment, you mean?
Yep.
Right,
And when I do
right.
that, I get half of the money from the sale, and each of the sellers gets half of the money. So in theory, they would do that because I have a longer reach, wider reach than they do. And, it's some posters are easier to sell. Our prices are quite reasonable in comparison to New York galleries, and I sell in Canadian dollars. So if you were looking for a particular poster and you found it with me, it would probably be 30% less than, at least 30% less than it would be in New York.
You mentioned on your website that there's been exponential growth in the last 20 years
Did I? I don't
somewhere.
remember that, but
In terms of well, I don't know if it's the value. I think it might be value. Is that right or not?
it depends on the poster. Again, not every poster has a value. Some have a value of, you like looking at it, that gives it a value, an emotional value. But there are posters by, you came in, I think you said you have a connection to Prague. So in Prague, Muka is a very well-known artist, and his real Muka posters appreciate because they are exceptional. They're harder to find now than they were 20 or 30 years ago, and they're instantly identifiable. So for instance, if you had a whackload of money and you wanted to make Ivan Lendl, just who is a Czech
Tennis
player,
player.
had a beautiful collection of mukas that he sold at auction maybe 10 years ago, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I'm sure he didn't pay as much, hopefully he didn't pay as much as he made, but so I mean, I think if I said exponent, I'll have to read my website again. I haven't read it in a while, but I think that in the 1880s there was something in Paris called poster mania, and people were stealing posters off the street. So my experience has been that that goes through cycles. I think we're again in a cycle where people understand posters, they're interesting, they're kind of vintage in the sense that they're printed, and now people are less familiar with printed things. So for people in the know and people who have some disposable income and the time to learn about posters, I think that, that market is growing.
Okay. What about shipping? Like, does that add really expensive to ship these things or not?
It depends on the size of the poster and the destination. I can ship things less expensively to Brussels than I can to the west coast of Canada. I mean, shipping internally in Canada is ridiculously
Yeah.
expensive for reasons I don't understand, but it's just a cost of doing business. If somebody's buying a lot of posters, I'm often happy to work with them on the shipping, and if I can, make it less expensive by combining shipments from, if you buy more than one poster, sometimes I'll absorb the cost of shipping, and so really depends.
What sells the most?
Oh, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be like a millionaire. It really depends on the seat. I can't answer that because there are, there's certain posters that sell a lot. We have a beautiful Prosecco poster by a Danish artist named Madsberg that's contemporary. It's easy. It kind of looks like Grace Kelly, Audrey Hepburn on a boat someplace, maybe in Cannes or Lake Como, and you could put it anywhere. And it's easy. There are gold standard artists that, if a client walks in and wants something, a statement piece, or I have corporate clients who want a collection of posters. It really, there's no easy answer to that. It's like, how did you decide to wear the shirt you're wearing today? You decided because you liked it, because it was clean, because, I don't know, it shows up well on camera. People make all kinds of different value decisions when buying a poster. What can I afford? Sometimes people, if they find an expensive poster and they can't really afford it, they'll look at it and they'll come back and then they'll look at it again. Or I'm happy to work with people on payments, but it's like they're permitting themselves to buy something like that. It's like a big purchase. So we have
Mm.
posters at $100. We have posters at tens of thousands of dollars. I sell $100 posters for every two $10,000 posters I sell. So it's just a question of disposable income.
In the book market, scarcity drives price. And I'm interested because with posters, especially these posters in the 1890s and around 1900, how do you know how many of them were printed and how many of them still
Generally
exist?
speaking,
You
you
just
don't.
don't know, right?
For Russian posters and Polish posters, oftentimes on the bottom line of the poster, there's printer's information and they'll show the quantity of how many were produced. But for other posters, you don't know. I mean, I can tell
Mhm.
you which ones I've seen more often. I can tell you which ones were reprinted at the time or subsequently. And I think if you're going to buy a vintage poster, it's important to buy it from someone who's a poster nerd, not just like a trunk show at like a flea market, because the chances that you're actually finding a vintage poster of some value at a flea market are close to zero.
Why is that? Like, because people know what they've got?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean there are a lot of people that fake vintage posters. You can go on mass market websites and buy a copy of a poster and that they don't, I mean, I know it's a copy, but it's not identified as a copy. It's not
Really?
like they're not saying this was a famous poster, and if you can buy a poster in any size on a website, that's the first dead giveaway. You're not buying a vintage poster because it only
Right.
came in one size.
Yeah. We've mentioned the names of some of the great poster designers, Charette, Toulouse-Lautrec, Mucha. What are the names of some of the others that stand out for you?
I think everybody has their own favorites. Capiello is a really well-known. His first publication, I think, would be in the 1890s, 1899, and he was really popular in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. You mentioned Bernhardt. Bernhardt has a lot of compatriots who kind of bridged the Art Nouveau, Art Deco period. I'm really fond of Julius Klinger. There was an exhibition at Poster House of his work, and I wrote a book about him, so I'm kind of like it's like a very narrow focus. Uh,
What's the story? What's his story?
well, like many other German or Austrian artists, he was born in I don't have the book in front of me, but let's call it the 1880s. unfortunately died during the Holocaust. There were a lot of very well connected, in the sense that they were connected to each other, Jewish artists of that period. And they worked together. Bernhard worked with them as well. And there's some great printers in Berlin at that time. So, it's a very small, they were the original poster nerds, I'd say. And that's a whole other conversation. But I would say that the French and the German, there were also the British had some. Austin Cooper was a great poster artist. Just so many, really, there are a lot. But if you wanted to get a great sense of, late 1890s, when poster mania was really going through Paris, I would circle back to the beginning of our conversation and look at the Maître de l'Affiche. And I could send you that link, and that way you can get a sense of who they were, and it's a good place to start.
Okay. So I'm going to wind down with a couple more questions here.
Go ahead.
I took the hint there. Why do you, other than the fact that you just love posters, why are you doing it? Or is that's the only reason?
I like to work for myself. I like art, and it has become more academic for me, and I like to use my brain. I think those would be the three answers I'd give. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
I construct it, the gallery is kind of like an extension of my home. It's like my living room. I'm comfortable there. During COVID, when I couldn't be open to the public, I would go in and just, it was my other safe space. So it is a safe, happy space for me.
I also like to ask why does it matter what you're doing? Why does it matter
To whom?
to you? Or why does what you do matter? Unless you
That's a
don't think what
very
you do,
existential
maybe
question.
you don't think what you do matters.
Of course, I think it matters, but I think it matters. I mean, it matters to me because of the reasons I gave you. I like to be challenged. I like to learn. And again, when we started, we were talking about familiarity. There's a certain, I love being surrounded by the posters because I'm happy. They're like people I know. It's like being
Yeah.
around a community of like-minded people. So I'm happy when people come in and they know nothing about posters and they come back with their friends. It means I've shown them something that excites them. And I like that. I think that matters. I think learning is important. I think teaching is important. Again, one of the other things we talked about is the team that I work with. They've become passionate poster people. So I mean, I think that the group therapy that I get on Saturday mornings is important for me, but I think that the passing on of this love of art and the history of posters is really important. So fundamental to the gallery and how it works. So I that would be my answer.
Yeah, I think this intersection between commerce and art is fascinating, and I think it's undervalued and maybe not necessarily understudied. I know that Stephen Heller has written about 5,000 books, and he's terrific. But it just seems that
Well, I mean,
more people should know about the important work that graphic designers have done.
well, I think it's something that graphic designers have struggled with. Again, I mentioned Julius Klinger, it's something he struggled with because he felt the graphic designers were not given as much attention as they should be given. In Germany in the 1920s, there was a very fine distinction drawn between fine art, which was painting, sculpture, and graphic art, which was less important
Yeah.
to some. You would not have a hard time finding people who have studied the intersection between art and commerce and have fought for the importance of both.
Mhm. Well, wonderful. Thank you for struggling through this interview with me
My
uh,
pleasure.
and nerding out. It was fun to nerd out, and it was also I just love. I mean, I just so wanted to talk to you. I was in the store a year or two ago, and I've been thinking about it ever since about just how wonderful it is.
Great. Well, tell all your friends.
I have been, and hopefully a few more will have learned about the place and the destination that it
Thank
is
you.
in
Well,
old Montreal.
send me a link to this podcast, and I'll be happy to put it on our social media.
Very good. Well,
All
thank
right.
you for your time. I've been talking with Karen Etingin,
Etingin. That's me.
and she is the owner of L'Affichiste, a poster shop in Montreal. The website is?
Lafichiste.com.
That's great. Thanks so much, Karen, for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Will do. Bye-bye.
Bye.